Good evening. The Mentor Board of Education organizational meeting for Tuesday, January 9th, 2018 is called to order. First, we will have the oath of office.
We'd ask the three board member-elects to go up to the podium with Judge.
Perfect. I just want to say it's an honor and a privilege to do this swearing in. And are we ready? Please raise your right hand. I state your name.
I, Virginia Jessling,
Do hereby swear
do hereby swear
that I will support
that I will support
the Constitution
the Constitution
of the United States
of the United States
and the Constitution
and the Constitution
of the State of Ohio,
of the State of Ohio,
and that I will,
and that I will,
to the best of my ability,
to the best of my ability,
faithfully perform
faithfully perform
and discharge
and discharge
the duties
the duties
of my office
of my office
as a member
as a member
of the
of the
Mentor Exempt Village
Mentor Exempted Village
School District
School District
Board of Education.
Board of Education.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Judge.
And then you'll sign right here. There's three of them.
Thank you.
Thank God for that second grade teacher who taught us how to do it cursive, huh?
After the meeting, or if you want to take them home, stop by sometime. A few signatures.
That's not good. Just remind me. Thank you.
Okay.
I am. All righty.
Take these with you then, okay? Congratulations. Congratulations. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Judge Treb. It's always a pleasure. All right, Mr. Wilson, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Buckley,
Present.
Ms. Jisling,
Present.
Mrs. Roberts,
Present.
Mr. Tuttle,
Present.
Mrs. Briner.
Here. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Nomination and election of president. Do I have a motion?
I'd nominate Mary Briner.
Second?
Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mr. Buckley,
Yes.
Ms. Jisling,
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts,
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle,
Yes.
Mrs. Briner.
Yes. Thank you. And nomination and election of vice president.
I'd like to nominate Mr. Tom Tuttle.
Second.
Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling,
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts,
Yes.
Mr. Buckley,
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle,
Of course.
Mrs. Briner.
Yes. And next, we have three committees that we need volunteers for. Anyone want to volunteer?
For the student achievement, I
Jenny?
would be happy to continue as student achievement liaison.
Thank you.
Legislative liaison, I'd like to continue.
Tom? And Mentor Schools Foundation?
Mrs. Briner, I can do that if you'd like.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you. And establishing place and time for regular meetings of the Board of Education. That will be second Tuesday of each month at 7 PM unless otherwise noted. Do we have a motion?
I move that we maintain the second Tuesday of every month unless otherwise noted.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Establishing Board of Education Service Fund for 2018. Motion.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Providing for employment of legal counsel for the Board of Education.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Approval of membership to the Ohio School Boards Association for 2018.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Approval of membership in the Ohio School Boards Association Legal Assistance Fund for 2018.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Approval of membership to the National School Board Association for 2018.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Appointment of a hearing officer.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Appointment of compliance officers.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorizing the superintendent to establish class fees, student fees, and other appropriate fees.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorizing compensation for some miscellaneous duties performed by certificated and classified staff members.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorization for Director of Business Operations to advertise for bids pursuant to Section 3313.46 of the revised code.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorizing the treasurer to file real estate complaints.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Requesting advance payment of funds from county treasurer.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorization for submission of grants and funding programs.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorizing the treasurer to maintain petty cash and change funds.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorizing selected student activity program contracts.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorizing non-salary remuneration for employees.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Dispensing with separate resolutions approving checks.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Authorizing blanket purchase orders.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. We're adjourned. The Mentor Public Schools Board of Education tax budget hearing for today, Tuesday, January 9th, 2018, is called to order. Please call the roll.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Present.
Mrs. Roberts?
Present.
Mr. Tuttle?
Here.
Mrs. Briner?
Here, please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Report of the Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Wilson.
Yes, thank you. This evening, we're conducting a hearing of the 2018-2019 tax budget as required by Ohio Revised Code. The notice of this hearing was published in the December 20th edition of the News Herald, and the tax budget was posted on our website for viewing. We also brought some copies tonight for anyone that may be interested. The purpose of the tax budget goes back to the Great Depression of 1929, when there was a time that local taxing entities actually did not need to collect all the previously voted tax revenues from the community. Thus, this requirement came into existence to document that we need the funds that the community has agreed to provide to the school district for educating our community's youth. We go through this exercise, it's filed with the Lake County Budget Commission, who then, based on the submission, will determine to levy all the taxes previously approved, and then away we go for the year. Part of the requirement is we conduct a public hearing, give the community any input on any questions or issues that they may have. Because of this somewhat dated regulation, we do this to ensure we can collect our tax revenues available to us, but our actual fiscal management and fiscal planning is more centered on our 5-year fiscal projections and on our annual budget rather than this document itself. But this will bring us into compliance and must be filed prior to January 20th. So at this time, I would accept any questions from the Board of Education or from the community.
Questions? Okay.
And then if not, then as part of our regular meeting, I'll ask for adoption of the budget.
Okay. All right, we will move for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes, we're adjourned.
Just exactly.
Good evening. The Mentor Schools Board of Education regular meeting is called to order for Tuesday, January 9th, 2018. Mr. Wilson, please call the roll.
Mr. Buckley?
Present.
Ms. Jisling?
Present.
Mrs. Roberts?
Present.
Mr. Tuttle?
Here.
Mrs. Briner?
Here, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The January 9th, 2018 regular meeting of the Mentor Exempted Village Board of Education is called to order. This meeting is being held in accordance with Section 3313.15 of the Ohio Revised Code. Please, I would like to welcome everyone to the meeting. Prior to this evening, each board member has received for their review and consideration the agenda and materials associated with each agenda item for the board's approval via the district's paperless Board of Education agenda system, Board Docs. The public can access the agenda through the school district's website. The agenda is available through the district's website for public viewing the Sunday prior to the board meeting. Board members have the opportunity to call the superintendent and chief financial officer for information concerning agenda items and to request, if needed, additional information. There are 2 places on the agenda when the board entertains comments from the community. The first hearing of the public is dedicated to those who wish to address the board on agenda items only. The second hearing of the public is dedicated to those who wish to address the board on any subject, whether it is an item on the agenda or another issue. When addressing the board, please state your name. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. Please address questions to the president. This meeting is being televised on a delayed basis and will be shown on Spectrum Cable Channel 1026 in Mentor and Channel 1025 in Mentor on the Lake. This meeting is also being videotaped and will be shown on our YouTube channel, Cardinal TV, Mentor, Ohio. Please place your mobile telephones on silent mode during the meeting if you have not already. I would like to please take a moment of silence in remembrance of Joanne Evans and Dave Messer. Thank you. Next, I would like to entertain approval of the meeting minutes from our regular board meeting on December 12th, 2017.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
I need to abstain.
Mrs. Roberts?
I need to abstain.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. And now we will entertain hearing of the public on agenda items only. No one? Thank you. Next, we will move to superintendent's report and recommendations. Mr. Porter.
Good evening, Madam President and members of the board. I have the following recommendations listed under the consent agenda and recommend approval of items 6A1 through 6A2.
Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
Thank you. Madam President and members of the board, January is School Board Recognition Month. The entire Mentor Schools community thanks you for everything you do to help make this school system so successful. Tonight, students from Lake Elementary School have a presentation for you. I'd like to invite their principal, Ms. Jody Paremba, to begin the presentation.
Madam President, members of the board, Mr. Porter and Mr. Wilson, thank you for allowing Lake Elementary to present to the for Board Appreciation Month on behalf of all of Mentor schools. According to the Ohio School Board Association, the theme for this year's presentation is School Boards Lead so Students Can Achieve. Inspired by last year's League of Innovative Schools visit, Lake Elementary started the school year with the theme Lake Elementary Rocks. We work with rock stars every day, including our amazing students, staff members, teachers, and administrators, and you, our board members. Our student council officers will be presenting a poem written by Mr. Dave Oler, one of our paraprofessionals. At this time, I would like to introduce our students that will be presenting. Haley Constantino, Blake Anderson, Josie Ludwig, Morgan Gessick, Jaden Gordon, Emma Sharp, Colby Spleet, Junie Torres, Emily Hallenbeck, Nathan Verhovnik, Ben McWilliams, Peyton Warner, Amariana Shearer, Brooklyn Brewington, Natalie Ploutz, and Hayden Overall.
Wait.
Menor School Board members, you are our rock stars. You are S, sensational, C, caring, H, hardworking, O, overachieving, O, one of a kind amazing, and L, leaders.
B, brilliant. O, optimistic. A, awesome. R, respectful. And D, diligent. Rock on, Minter School Board members. You feel the rhythm of education. You strum to the beat of learning. You lead us to our future.
To commemorate this evening, we would like to present each board member with a Rockstar Recognition Award.
This award is presented to Miss Briner, School Board Member. This award is presented to Miss Jessling, School Board Member.
Thank you so much.
This award is presented to Mr. Tuttle, School Board Member. This award is presented to Miss Roberts, School Board Member.
Thank you so much.
This award is presented to Mr. Buckley, School Board Member. This award is presented to Mr. Porter, Interim Superintendent. This award is presented to Mr. Wilson, Chief Financial Officer.
School Board members, on behalf of Lake Elementary and all of Menor Schools, we all thank you.
We are all better learners because of all the work you do. Thank you. Lake Elementary. Hashtag Lake ES rocks.
Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate you all coming out tonight and giving us that presentation. And I think I speak for all the board in saying you guys really rocked that tonight for us. Thank you very, very much.
Let me add one thing. I'm not going to tell you how many years I've been on the board, but long enough to have a few of these, and they all line up together. I keep the dust off them in my office at home. The little meaningless golf trophies I won all the line. These are the top shelf trophies, I can tell you that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam President and members of the board, at this time I would like to invite Mr. Casella and Ms. Jesling to recognize the senior student athletes of the Mentor High School football team as state runner-ups, along with Coach Trivisonno. They are representing the entire team tonight, and we are proud of not only their success on the field, but the way they handle themselves with class on and off the field.
Madam President, members of the board, Mr. Porter and Mr. Wilson, it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to the senior members of the Mentor High School football team. The Mentor High football team once again represented the Mentor schools in fantastic fashion this season, uniting our community to cheer them on. This season, the Cardinals were Greater Cleveland Conference champions, regional champions, and advanced to the state championship game in Canton. Although the state final did not go the way we wanted it to, we should be proud of their efforts, the way they represented themselves, their school, and their community. At this time, I'd like Coach Trivisonno to join me up here. And boys, as I call your name, please come up and greet the board members and stay up here until all names have been called. Stephen Baird. Mike Bray. Guys, come over here first, and then you can go there. Charlie Call. Steve.
Thank you so much.
Tyler Cherney. Dominic DeFranco. Jameer Dodson. Chris Edmond. Daniel Garkar. Matt Hartman.
Awesome.
John Kidner. Sam Kirshner. Derek Kleinhens. Will Leganke. Eli McDougall. James Prunty. Tyler Schonauer. Logan Shea. Dominic Shelley. Tadas Tatarunas. Playing basketball tonight. Mike Warren.
Thank you for a great season.
These are the senior football players of this year's state runner-up team. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Coach Trivisonno to say a few words.
I got to first to say, I'm not sure we can top that Lake Elementary presentation. that was impressive. We're really proud of you guys and what you did today. I got to say this, I'm not sure people realize how hard it is to play 15 weeks and 15 games. It's a grind, it's a challenge. I think our last 7 games, 5 of them came down to the last drive in one way or the other. This is a special group of guys here, a group of guys who worked. We counted it right before the game. It was 306 days we started preparing for that opportunity. 306 days that they prepared for that game. It's a little or coming up on almost a year, they just kept battling and working. But not only that, they're a great group of young men, and you look at them, and as a city, we couldn't be more proud of how they played, how they represented us. They took a city, they put it on its back, and they took it for a heck of a ride, and I couldn't be more proud of these group of men, of what they did and how they handled themselves the whole way, and I think hopefully everyone here was proud of what they did, and we want to thank all of you for what you gave us and gave us the opportunity to be there and go for an amazing experience. So thank you very much. We appreciate all your support, and best of luck, everybody. Thank you.
We're going to take a break at this time, 5-minute break. Anybody that would like to leave for the evening, thank you for coming out. You're welcome to stay. We'll recess for 5 minutes. Thank you. The board meeting is back in session. Mr. Porter?
Thank you. Madam President and members of the board, at this time I will be giving a presentation on facilities and resources strategic planning. Why the need? As you know, we've undertaken a large facilities work this year in preparing for the future, and that was something that really needed to be done. First, to continue and further advance a high-quality education here in Mentor. That's the reason we exist, and so that stays at the forefront of what we do each day. Striking the right size and balance across the district is critically important. And most districts, as you know, are either growing or they're shrinking. Very few just remain constant over time. And if a district has to grow or shrink, obviously districts need to make the appropriate adjustments as they go. Fiscal responsibility stays at the forefront as well as we try to make efficient use of taxpayer dollars. And if we can do that, with these particular facility changes that I'm recommending, this provides over a 5-year forecast of about a $7 million or more savings, which is not insignificant. It also allows us to position ourselves for the future for many years to come, both financially and in terms of enrollment and buildings. Again, the savings to the general fund can really be broken down 4 different ways. If we were to close one elementary school, it's almost $800,000 of annual savings, and a second elementary school, about another $750,000 in annual savings. Closing a middle school, it's almost 1.5 in annual savings. If we did that and we were able to reopen one elementary school, which is part of my recommendation, you can see the projected 1-year savings boils down to, with some adjustment in there, for necessary one-time things, $1.1 million or more just in a single year. Again, school finances go out over a 5-year forecast, and that can amount to over $7 million of savings in a 5-year forecast. So the processes of transparency, of communication and transparency are certainly very important as well. Over time, and this is something we do every single year, we are able to study enrollments and capacities, and that's something we have an obligation to look at constantly to see what kind of changes our district will be encountering. Last year, there were a series of facility meetings that began to explore different ideas and different possibilities, and more meetings took place over the summer. Along the way, we used the commenter, which is mailed to the residents of Mentor, along with video updates that I provided, and both large and small group gatherings with different staff groups and PTA parents and other groups to help us sort of understand the facilities issues. And that included a report that I gave back in October here at the board meeting at that time. And the theme that I have tried to convey over and over is, this is the time, this is the year to make some decisions to go into effect for next year. In September of this year, we took a large step in a task force that formed under the larger umbrella of the strategic plan, one of our resources/facilities group was formed at that time and started having meetings. And then we've also included student input, in particular from high school students we met with, as well as from the 3 middle schools, to get some of their views on facilities and the differences in the schools and some of their perceptions, which was interesting. Going back to the task force, which was sort of a huge springboard for some of the work that we had done in the fall, it was a series of different stakeholders that came together, about 30 in all, and there were 5 meetings specifically with that group and 1 meeting with the bigger strategic planning group that took place. The group was made up of different stakeholders ranging from administrators to teachers to classified staff to board members to community members, and we had many PTA parents representing different schools around the district on that task force as well. Their role was not to vote on anything or not to make the actual final decision. Rather, their role was to make suggestions along the way, react to different ideas and possibilities, provide feedback and advice, particularly with different scenarios that came up. And throughout the course of the process, there was a lot of consensus on certain big ideas, one of those being the fact that they too agreed this is the time, this is the year to make some decisions to put into effect for next year. They also agreed that there's underutilization of space in many of our buildings, particularly at the middle school levels, as we looked at some of those percentages. They agreed that the boundaries needed to be studied. In some places on our maps, the boundaries make very good sense right now, and in other places on the maps, the boundaries don't seem to fit right now where the schools are, and over the course of time that sometimes happens, particularly with enrollment shifts and residency shifts. And so those were things that the committee or the task force agreed to. What was great also about the task force is they provided many different opinions along the way. That included differences of opinion about which buildings would potentially be affected. There were many different opinions on that, and even grade level configurations. There was a time where we looked at the possibility of a 5th and 6th grade building for all the students in those grades in Mentor, and a 7th and 8th grade building for all the students in Mentor. There were some things about those plans that were not ultimately feasible, so that idea was taken away, it fell off the table, but there was a lot of good discussion that generated, and it was good to get the different perceptions from different corners of the district. We also worked on specifically different scenarios, and what the group very helpfully pointed out pros and cons with each different scenario that we provided, and they also highlighted along the way things that we needed to pay attention to, whatever decision that we reached, that ultimately, in the terms of what do we think about, how do we communicate it, how to be sensitive about doing all of that. So all of that was helpful from the task force. I see many task force members here tonight, and I'm very grateful for the work that you put in, because that was a lot of, especially early mornings, working on some pretty complex stuff. Ultimately, a decision was needed, and that falls onto my shoulders to recommend to the Board of Education what I feel will best serve our district well now and into the future, which is what tonight's presentation is about. The board will have an opportunity, hopefully in a few weeks, to vote on the changes, and it goes into effect for the 18-19 school year. The first recommendation that I would make is to close Ridge Middle School as a middle school, particularly in light of the serious enrollment shift that has taken place over the years. Back in 12, 13 years ago, around 2006, we had 630 students at Ridge. Next year, if we were to continue on the same path, we'd be down to 450 students. And we have about 750 at Memorial at this time, about 560 at Shore at this time. We have an opportunity to consolidate our middle school students. So I'm recommending a redistribution of Ridge students to Memorial and Shore middle schools. We would do that by way of the zones that already exist. The Brentmore zone students would end up going to Memorial Middle School. The students that are in the Bellflower zone would go to Shore Middle School. What that would also do is it would give a lot of balance to the two remaining middle schools. Both would have similar numbers in the mid to high 800s if we were to do that way. I would also, knowing what Ridge offers as a building and as a property, I would recommend reopening Ridge right away for the 18-19 school year as an elementary school. It can be an outstanding elementary school. And one thing that it would allow us to do immediately is to keep the preschool, which has been there now for several years. It would keep the preschool at Ridge. And that just shows you, it gives you an idea, and I know that the streets are impossible to read from where you sit, but it gives you an idea of the yellow being the Memorial Zone and the blue being the Shore Zone, and you would have a pretty evenly balanced set of student bodies and enrollments with this map configuration. The advantages, the physical advantages to keeping Ridge open as an elementary school is we can get everybody on one floor because staircases and folks who work in elementary schools know this. You know, having multiple staircases provide multiple challenges for different things that may be happening. So everybody's on one floor at Ridge. They have some of the most spacious halls and classrooms in the district, and it actually flows very well in a rectangle around the school, and from the rectangle it branches out into different hallways. So it does feel very spread out, even if a lot of students are in the building. There is, unlike almost any other elementary school with the exception of Orchard Hollow, it would have its own separate cafeteria and gymnasium. Actually, it would be in two separate locations completely. And the gymnasium, I'll say, some high schools would be jealous of that gymnasium between the size of it and the seating available. And it also has a large net to divide down the middle that our elementary schools don't currently have. It is in a good location, accessible from many major arteries, and it's a good piece of land as well. And those are just some of the physical advantages. I would recommend calling it Ridge Elementary School and recommending that it become, like many of our other schools have, the Cardinals as well. Some modifications would be needed inside the building to help prepare it to be more of an elementary building than may currently exist. The media center, the large media center they have near the front of the building, would not necessarily be needed. We would create a media center space more typical in size to elementary media centers in a different location. But the current media center could be broken up into individual classrooms and built very nicely just across the hallway from the main office, easily accessible to our administrators. Some of our related art spaces could use some redesign in there, and our locker rooms would be available at some point, whether it's this year or in the future, to turn that into learning space as well. We do not need locker rooms in elementary buildings. Modifications outside the building would include on the back or on the side of the building and in the back parking lot, more asphalt and putting down more pavement, particularly in the back, which would allow, because when you build playgrounds, you do want a certain amount of asphalt space for students to recreate on. So that would be an opportunity there. We would obviously need to add some playground equipment. We currently have some preschool playground equipment on the one side of the building, but we would want to put in some equipment that's appropriate for K through 5 in other spots, and hopefully we would be able to use the resources of the elementary buildings that I'm going to recommend that we close as a result of reopening Ridge. Modifications would be paid for through the permanent improvement money that comes from past and even future sales of land and buildings, which is a separate pot of money from the general fund that we talked about a few minutes ago. Brentmore would be one of the buildings that I would recommend closing in light of reopening Ridge. A couple of main reasons. Brentmore is one of our oldest buildings, our second oldest elementary building, and has served many, many good years in its capacity. But particularly the proximity to Ridge It's virtually across the street. It would not make sense to have two elementary schools so close together, and Ridge could fit many more students than Brentmore could. Garfield would be the other elementary school that I would recommend for closing. It was originally built in 1938 with the gymnasium wing added later. If you've been in Garfield, you'll know it has at least 3 levels. I might even argue that it has 4 levels if you count one of the stairwell or one of the landing classrooms that it has. Many, many stairs in Garfield. And their classrooms, quite frankly, are much smaller than what would be ideal. They have served as great learning spaces, but as students do group rotation and spread out with their learning spaces, the classrooms may not fit as well as some of the alternative classrooms that we could find at Ridge and some of the other buildings in the district. So as we look at boundaries, one of the things that would be important to think about is some of our boundaries, again, make perfect sense. Other boundaries we need to look at a little bit. We want to get some of the boundaries geographically closer to the schools so it makes more sense. I want to also at the same time create enrollment balance, which we can do under this plan. And we want to allow some wiggle room in each of the schools to add enrollment, particularly as developments aren't getting built very quickly in Mentor, but there are still some developments that are popping up throughout town. We have been in touch with the city to get a feel for what developments are there and how soon they might start or be ready. And we need to remember too that even with a development of 50 homes, only about 17% of the homes in Mentor have school-age children in them. With that in mind, a neighborhood with 50 homes will still not send, hundreds and hundreds of students to a school in the area. You might get 10 to 20 students from a new neighborhood that pops up in a typical situation on average. So the redistribution that I would propose would be Fairfax, the very, very northern end tip of Fairfax, and it's about 6 or 7 streets that are north of Munson and Lakeshore Boulevard. Those streets sit almost directly behind Shore Middle School. Those streets go to Fairfax. They also go to Memorial Middle School, a fair amount of distance from there, even though those streets sit right behind Shore. I'd be recommending in this plan that for middle schoolers, those middle schoolers would go to Shore with some intra-district open enrollment options available for those students to be able to possibly remain at Memorial because it's a small number of students and several of them have already started Memorial. By the same token, from that same neighborhood, it makes sense Orchard can certainly take on more students in their student body. And that neighborhood is just as close to Orchard as it is to Fairfax. Geographically, it would make sense to move that group of students over to Orchard Hollow starting next year. Brentmore Elementary would be a little bit easier to understand in the sense that Brentmore students, the whole student body, would move into the new Ridge Elementary building. Garfield Elementary, depending on which neighborhood in Garfield one lives in, some of those neighborhoods are a little bit closer to Fairfax. So we project about 120 to 125 students going from the Fairfax, going from the Garfield, a certain Garfield area, sort of on the north end of their zone into Fairfax. Hopkins Elementary, we would recommend that for Garfield, a good chunk of Garfield students in the 200s would go to Hopkins Elementary School, particularly the group that lives to the furthest eastern point in our district or to the southeast, and most of that is Concord Township. Also, Hopkins Elementary, Garfield, there'd be a small neighborhood also that could feed into Ridge and again be very accessible to Ridge Middle School from Garfield. As far as Hopkins Elementary, we would have a fair number of students staying at Hopkins, but there would be a large chunk of students from the current Hopkins zone that would go into Ridge Elementary School to fill that school out. It's sort of hard to see. But this would be your new Hopkins zone right here. Hopkins is here. The neighborhood directly surrounding Hopkins geographically would be very close and able to attend there. This neighborhood, which has had to typically bypass Hopkins to get to Garfield, would be much closer to their school right here. So all of this dark blue would be the new Hopkins zone. All of the pink, this is the Brentmore zone over here, and then most of this part right here is currently Hopkins. They would join with Ridge Elementary School, and we know that there are many good arteries, Route 84, Little Mountain Road, that can help people get here. And we checked this on Google Maps, within 10 to 12 minutes from even the furthest reaches of this zone. Fairfax here, most of it stays intact there in the middle, but they pick up, most of this right here is industrial. This neighborhood here, closest to Fairfax, could go right there and keeps that zone together. And then the very northern tip of the current Fairfax zone would join up with Orchard and be about the same distance from Orchard as they are from Fairfax. These maps, by the way, are available in the emails that have been sent out this afternoon and this evening. Also, the maps are available, I believe, on the website at this time. So that'll allow people to get a closer look at individual streets and boundaries. Special education units are affected a little bit by this as well. There are currently 2 special education units at Garfield that will fit nicely at Ridge, which already have some facilities in place. There are 2 units at Fairfax for structured language students, and that would be moved to Orchard Hollow Elementary. And then there are students from 2 units at Ridge Middle School, and they would relocate to Shore Middle School, which has ample space for them. And actually, many of those students reside in the Shore zone anyway, so that makes sense from that standpoint. This gives you an idea of enrollments now and next year with the projections. And I have to say projections because one of the things that's impossible to be for sure on next year, the kindergarten enrollment from any neighborhoods, those always fluctuate a little bit from year to year, but we have ways of estimating based on past kindergarten numbers coming in and averages and some trends. We're able to project kindergartners, so with the projections, you can see the numbers. And this is before any kind of intra-district open enrollment and that. So middle schools are close to even. Bellflower is under 500 for the first time in the last couple of years. Fairfax would go up to about 379, which they have ample space for. Hopkins was the one school that has been a little bit overcrowded for a few years. This helps to solve that and right sizes them. Lake Elementary remains similar. Orchard has room to go up a little bit. The Ridge Elementary School, with some modifications inside, can very comfortably fit 750 students. And Sterling Morton stays very close to 300 there. As far as personnel goes, teaching and classified, we're very sensitive to our certified and our classified staff. Many of them have to move too in an undertaking such as this. And our goal is to preserve as many positions as possible while still benefiting from the savings available. And this is a process that actually takes a few months to play out. We're going to work carefully with the Mentor Teachers Association, Mentor classified employees, and their leadership to help us get to a good conclusion with our staff. As far as administrators are concerned, Mr. Kamenicki, who's currently serving as the principal at Garfield, and Ms. Hutto, serving currently as the principal at Brentmore Elementary, would join forces and serve in a unique situation as co-principals at the New Ridge Elementary. Mr. Kamenicki would focus more K2, Ms. Hutto 3-5, but they will both be equal partners in that arrangement, and that puts, the challenges and excitement of getting a new building repurposed and up running as an elementary school will fall on both of their capable shoulders. And they work very well together now. It will continue as they take that on. Ms. Blackburn and Mr. Dwyer, who currently serve as the principal and assistant principal at Ridge Middle School, will move over to Memorial Middle School and continue the good work there, and they'll serve as principal and assistant in those same roles at Memorial. Mr. Dudziak is going to return to the Mentor High School and will serve as a unit principal. So those are some of the administrative adjustments that will take place as a result. Start times may not matter to some families. It may be very important to a number of families. We anticipate that Ridge Elementary will adopt Brentmore's time, which is an 8:55 to 3:05 time frame for students. We anticipate Hopkins staying the same, 9 o'clock to 3:10. Orchard staying the same, 8:50 to 3 o'clock. Fairfax would be one of the exceptions. They would become an early building, exact time to be determined. Their time could possibly replace the Garfield time of 7:50 to 2 o'clock. But we will nail down the specifics of that as the transportation goes. And the two middle schools we anticipate remaining the same time as they are now, 8:40 to 3:40. We also would like to see some aesthetic upgrades to Shore Middle School. And more of their classrooms have been updated quite a bit in the last couple of years, but their cafeteria and ultimately their hallways could use some work. Some of this may be done sooner and some of it may be done a little bit later, but that's something that's on our radar that I think is important to mention as we go to two middle schools. So communications timeline. Today, several things happened. It was a big day here in Mentor. The staffs who are most affected by this, namely Garfield, Brentmore, and Ridge, I met with in person today at the conclusion of their school days and had direct conversations. And those were very good meetings, although they were not easy meetings by any stretch. Also, the task force was sent an email late this afternoon, so they had an update on what was happening, and that included a video that I had put together a few days ago, updating these changes in a much briefer way than is happening now. District-wide staff got an email with that video attachment a little earlier this evening, and parents hopefully should have gotten the email and the video as well just earlier this evening. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, it's important to note there are more staff meetings I'm going to have in person with the affected staffs, other affected staffs. I have Hopkins and Fairfax tomorrow, Shore and Memorial the day after that. I'm meeting with PTA presidents as part of our regularly scheduled meetings in person this Friday to have some conversations about how they can help with the transitions that are happening. And then there are going to be parent meetings for each set of affected schools that will be coming up here in Paradigm on certain evenings in the next week or so at certain times. And I'll show you those in a second. Along with that, we're going to send out via email the school assignment information for any students who are wondering, any of these affected schools. Parents will be receiving emails early next week that their sons or daughters will be going to whatever school it may be. And we're also going to follow that up with a similar letter in U.S. postal mail early February. So we're trying to communicate this in as many ways as we possibly can to try to clear up any confusion about changes. The parent meeting schedule is here. Fairfax later this week at 5:30 on Thursday night. Tuesday of next week, We'll meet with any Brentmore families that would like to attend at 5:30 here in Paradigm. Any Ridge families that want to talk about the changes can come 7:30 next week on the 16th. And then the final date would be Wednesday, the 17th. Garfield Elementary School parents are welcome to come. And at 7:30 that same night, Hopkins Elementary School parents are welcome to come. This is also part of the mailings and the announcements that went out earlier today, so you have this at your disposal. What's very, very important is to continue, and we know this from some of our past school closures, with transition activities, starting now all the way through next fall and as needed. But that could include things such as open houses and socials. They could be meetings of kind of a logistical or scheduling nature or academic, and it could be something as simple as tours to get students, parents, and new staff familiar with their surroundings. We also recognize, particularly for those buildings whose service is ending to the district, at least in the capacity that it is at Ridge, for Ridge, Garfield, and Brentmore, it's important to honor the roles that they've played in the history of our district. And we want to work with each staff to come up with activities between now and the end of the year that will do just that. As we think about it, those schools have helped to educate tens of thousands now, tens of thousands of mentor, students through the years. I do fully recognize the difficulty of change, but we ultimately have the responsibility to maintain and further advance our students' education while maintaining a safe and comfortable learning environment for everyone. And we have a responsibility to our residents, our taxpayers, to operate with fiscal prudence every single year. We also need to position ourselves for the present and the future. We can't ignore the obvious, which is our enrollment dropping, underutilization of our buildings, and the need to redraw some boundaries. But I recognize change is difficult. And actually, I think more than anything, it's difficult for the adults. Students are very, very resilient, and we've seen that every single time. They're the first ones to embrace change. So I believe with the adult modeling from all of our stakeholders, the students will come around and make beautiful transitions through it all. So I'm going to propose at this time 3 things. First, I do want to answer any questions from the board. I do then, after that, want to set a date that this can be formally voted on. And then I do want to offer the opportunity for another opportunity at a public hearing in the middle of this meeting at the conclusion of my being at the podium for anyone to come up and, with questions or comments or anything of that nature. So first, any questions I may answer for the Board of Education.
I very much appreciate the sensitivity with which you've approached this, because I know it is hard. But in terms of, especially Garfield, and nobody would know better than Mr. Buckley, having been principal at Garfield, a building with so many levels poses all sorts of accessibility concerns. And taking that into account made a particular amount of sense. So when making those staff assignments, will there be consideration for district-wide staff too? I know some of our related arts staff travel between buildings. Do you have a way to manage that in particular?
So if I'm understanding the question, even staff that might be in unaffected buildings will have a chance. There's always an opportunity, and a staff member, on the certified side, anyway, a teaching side, can fill out at any time a request form to be considered for transfer to other locations, regardless of whether there's an opening in another location. We encourage staff to fill that out, because if someone would like to work at a different grade level or work in a different building, if we know that, and then we also conclude that's a good fit for our district, that helps us. So we encourage staff to fill out those forms, and they can submit that to the HR department at any time. So that can certainly come, under consideration, yes.
Would that be something that you'd kind of remind people about, that's, not everybody?
Through the course of the year, we do remind people with the announcements happening, there's opportunity, again, to remind people, absolutely.
I just had one other question. So in terms of Mrs. Hutto and Mr. Kamenicki, will they follow their students the way our high school unit principals do, or will they maintain expertise in those grade levels in that curriculum?
I would expect that they would maintain expertise in those grade levels. In Ms. Hutto's case, all of the students from Brentmore are with her, they're following her. In Mr. Kamenicki's case, there are only 50 from Garfield that are coming over, about 50, give or take. But they would remain stationary is how I see it. But they would be the principal, co-principals of the entire school with just a focus on those grade levels. Not exclusive, though.
Gotcha, thanks.
Excuse me. I appreciate all the work that you've done in the task force. This is, as you said, it's a very difficult thing, and change is very difficult, especially when it affects our kids. Having moved my children into mentor schools when they were in 4th and 5th grade, it was very difficult. But the one thing that I need to say is because our teachers and our staff are so excellent, it was such a smooth transition. Mrs. Pirro, Mrs. Kalovic embraced my kids. They became a part of the mentor community so quickly, and now they're just these fabulous high school marching band members. Woohoo! But I appreciate that, and I know that our staff is up to this. I don't have any question about that. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the transition activities that you've got into play. I think that's extremely important, just as we transition our kids from middle school to the high school, or from the junior high or the elementary schools to the middle schools, having that time in the buildings and getting to know their friends. So I appreciate everything that you guys have done with this, and it's a sound plan. Do you have any idea of the general class sizes we can expect?
I appreciate that question, because one of the things that we've been committed to, and since even before I came into the district 10 years ago, would be to maintain very good class sizes in terms of student-teacher ratio in the classrooms. We've generally operated sort of in the low 20s for elementary school. Now, this is an average. And more of the mid-20s for the upper elementary schools. And then between 25 and 30 for our middle school and high school classes. Now, that's not always, if you look at our class sizes, you'll see some that are outliers that go outside the zone. We have no plan to change the average class sizes. We want to maintain those ratios. We think that's important to continuing the high-quality education.
Great, thank you.
I would just like to add, having been a mentor student and a mentor graduate myself, also being actively involved in the schools since the closing of Reynolds and subsequent closings. I was involved in all the task forces after the closing of Reynolds, including this task force. So I have a lot of history here in the mentor schools. This is a big change for us. We've never kept it a secret that there's going to be changes in the district. The board and the superintendent and the treasurer, we're tasked with staying on top of these things. We have to answer to the community and the stakeholders and be fiscally responsible. We can't operate the schools at half or quarter capacity. So these changes are needed. Mr. Porter and the rest of the staff is here to answer questions. I think initially it's going to be a big change for parents and students and some of our staff. But when you look at the big picture and you look at the fact that we are an excellent school district, all of our schools are excellent, they're well achieving. The students and the parents are going to do fine. We've bounced back from these changes before, and we will continue to do so. These changes are going to be good. They're going to be positive. So if they weren't, we wouldn't be recommending these changes. So try to keep in mind the big picture and know that we're all in this together, and try to look at the positive side of things. It's going to be a good change for everyone.
Thank you.
I would just like to thank Mr. Porter because I did besiege him with questions. And just like to remind everyone that change is not an event, it's a process, and we'll work through this together. As a board member, I'm willing to listen to any feedback that parents, citizens can offer, and I'm guessing the rest of the board members would be willing to do that as well.
We
Bill?
are all in this together.
Could you speak to the cost savings? Because that is one of the determining factors that contributed to making this decision, better utilization of the assets that we had. But how do we accumulate that savings? If you could just, in an
Sure.
overview, break out.
So without having it in front of me, you could talk about things such as utilities over the course of time. Now, as long as you own the building, you may have to maintain sort of minimum requirements, but it could be utility costs. It's certainly going to be some savings in staff because you're not going to need as many administrators in the district, or possibly other positions, classified positions. Just as an example, custodial services, generally that is the work for custodials parceled out more by square footage. If we have less square footage to have to maintain on a day-to-day basis, there's cost savings right there. So it comes in a couple of different sets of categories, ranging from those sorts of things, utilities and those types of costs, to actual people savings. And so one of the things to cost out to get to the figures that you saw tonight, and we do have sheets available, again, to you, would be to kind of parcel that out so you can see each and every dollar figure attached to how we get the bigger numbers that you saw on the screen tonight. So.
The reason why I ask you, because I think the community needs to know, in general, what supports those numbers, and will we realize them, or will it be absorbed somewhere else?
And the way the formula was set up, what was done, and Mr. Wilson had the wisdom to do this, we set it up in order to, what are the reductions for the 3 buildings, closing Ridge as a middle school, because there's some savings just that alone, closing an elementary school, closing another elementary school, and then reopening Ridge, then, some of the savings, you'd have to spend a little bit. But the overall net savings would be, and so that it does go down to, it's not guesswork. And if we make any changes to the formula, we would have to make an adjustment somewhere else. So if we decided to keep, let's say, an extra staff person in a certain area, we would want to adjust a staff person somewhere else. But we have to project that out so we can give more exact numbers like we did tonight.
Certainly I understand that better utilization of the assets we have is the smartest way to run the schools, without a doubt, and I definitely support that. So thank you for pulling this all together.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Well done.
Do you have, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you have any plans for engaging an architect to do some of the design that's going to be needed for repurposing Ridge?
Yes.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. So at this time, I wanted to see if we'd be able to compare our calendars and potentially come up with a night to make a vote on the plan.
Is there a particular week that you had in mind?
It could be, I would like all of the parent meetings to have happened. So the earliest time after that would be Thursday, the 18th, or Friday, the 19th. The following week in the evening is also available.
I didn't know if anybody was interested in attending the, Chardon invited our state legislators to come on down and tell us, or come on up, I guess, tell us all about school funding, and that takes place on Thursday, the 18th. So I'd like to be able to go to that.
Where and when is that?
I have a
It's
commitment on the 18th.
Okay.
That Chardon, I believe it's at 7 o'clock at the Chardon Board of Education on Thursday, January 18th. I thought it made sense for us to
We'll send out
show
some
up in
notice.
force.
Thank you.
Since they have some of their specific legislators, but I know it's some of the broader ones who are, it's at 7 o'clock at the Chardon Board of Education.
Thank you, Ginny.
Sure, and
So-
that seemed like a
Okay.
Thursday, the 18th, so I'd like to avoid that day for that reason.
All right, do we want to look at the week of the 22nd then?
Or the 19th, is that a bad day? You said,
The 19th is a Friday night, but we could do it on the 19th.
if that's not a good day, we could pick something the following week. But I'm available really I can do the following week, or the 19th is also fine for me.
Can do any day except for the 24th.
Okay.
How's the 23rd look?
23rd's good for me. You're doing the State of the Schools luncheon that day?
It's okay.
23rd?
So it'll be really
sound-
good.
I can't
2
make
weeks
that.
from now.
Can't make
Is
it.
that good?
23rd, I can't make. I've got a
can't.
board meeting at Lake Georgia
Okay.
Recovery Center.
24th is bad.
That was bad for Ken.
It's bad for me.
How's the 22nd?
It's okay.
22nd's okay, 25th's okay to me.
I'm
Those
good
are
for
20
22nd, not the 23rd.
5:30?
22nd, we could do.
What time works for you, Bill?
Yep.
5:30?
5:30?
And that's going to be considering the resolution to approve going forward? Is that?
Yes.
That's,
Uh,
Okay. And then at this time, I would like to offer sort of a unique opportunity. I would return to my seat, and with Madam President's permission, I would ask that we do a special hearing of the public specific to this topic at this time for anyone who would like to come forward.
Okay, the board will entertain any questions from the public related to Mr. Porter's presentation, and those questions will be directed to Mr. Porter. Anyone from the public? Please state your name. Comments and questions are limited to 3 minutes, please.
Hello, my name is Kelly Balin, and Mr. Porter, my question is kind of a question concern as far as the health tech situation goes in the buildings. I hear a growing number of concerns from parents because the health techs, at least, I know some of the schools are not full-time. Will this allow for the schools to have a full-time health tech in every elementary building?
I don't anticipate that it would necessarily do that, particularly in the smaller buildings, but given that there would be fewer buildings, there would be more, we'll call it health tech coverage available more often to some of the buildings.
Okay, thank you.
My name's Bridget McLaughlin. With the projected enrollment of Ridge at 750, and it currently is a middle school, what is your expected staffing as far as the office to take care of the needs of the students at the middle school with regards to office and custodial personnel? Thank you.
Thank you. We would anticipate trying to look at ratios and come up with similar ratios as would exist with some of the elementaries that are out there. So we do recognize, and some of this has been built into the projected costs, there would be more of some of those positions than there would be in some of the other elementary schools.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Thank you. Madam President and members of the board, I am recommending approval of new policy 8.18.
So moved?
Second?
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
Thank you. Madam President and members of the board, I am recommending approval of agenda item C1 related to certified staff and C2 through C5, all related to human resource matters.
So moved. Second?
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
Thank you. This concludes my portion of tonight's agenda.
Thank you. Board of Education report and recommendations. Any business? Yes, we heard about the meeting in Chardon. Thank you, Ms. Jeschling.
Oh, yes.
Legislative report, Mr. Tuttle.
Well, I passed that out this evening. What I want to call your attention to is a Senate Bill 240 that was introduced by Senator Leonard with regard to teacher evaluations, in that which they are attempting to make a change in the evaluations and those things that are used in evaluating our teachers. And I just want to call it to your attention that they want to change the percentage of the evaluations impacting student growth, student advancement, student improvement. So it's a new one. They want to make some changes. They want to reduce the percentage, and just calling it to the board's attention and to our teachers and our staff. Certainly feel free to contact our state legislators and express your opinion. Don't let it go without notice, please. So, thank you. The rest of the things are just on my report, are not, some are very important, but this, I think, impacts public education across the state and our teachers. So, thank you.
Do you have plans to go to Washington next month for Legislative Day?
No, I don't, but in March, we'll have a legislative meeting of the Ohio School Board Association in Columbus, and have a day of listening to our legislators and also meeting with our personal legislators. And let me add one other thing, if I could, that's also, now that you bring that up, on my report, the OSBA legislative platform has been printed and issued, and you'll see that shortcut on the legislative report that you can go to it. It's quite lengthy, it's comprehensive. There's 22 pages. I have one extra printed copy. Actually, I have two, if you'd care to have that, and either one of you two. What's important there is they're asking us to read it. If we agree with it, fine. If you think there are some improvements or changes they go too far or they don't go far enough, I think if you review that at our next board meeting, we can have a discussion on any changes you might recommend, and we can process. They asked that we pass a resolution, have it voted on the board, and then submit that to OSBA, because we all know that it's better to have an opinion and express an opinion than to sit back and not say anything. So I have two copies. If someone would like one,
I'll take one.
I'll be happy to give it to you. Anybody else?
Yep.
Okay.
I was on that committee last year. We actually sent an amendment.
That's
which got
great,
approved
Mary.
last year.
I think it's very important.
It was an enlightening experience.
It's an easy read. It seems like a lot of topics, but if you take one and pass the other one down to Ginny.
Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome. So, having said
All right.
that. And then we can talk about that being on the agenda next month in February, because they want our resolution, if we have any, or more than one, to get that to them by March. So, thank you.
Thank you. All right, moving along, Chief Financial Officer's report and recommendations, Mr. Wilson.
Yes, presenting for your approval, agenda items 7A through G as a consent agenda. And I'd like to just comment on the monthly financial statements. Year-to-date, we are tracking revenue and expenses very closely to budget as expected. We have one positive variance on the revenue side, and that's the investment income. As the board may remember, we changed investment advisors a few months ago, and with that, reanalyzed and changed our asset mix as well as our time horizon for maturities. And with more activity from the new investment advisors, we've now earned 80% of our budgeted income after half of the year. So very pleased with some positive results. Some of that could also be attributed to rates are creeping up, nowhere near pre-Great Recession, but there has been some modest movement, but we feel very good about value added from our new relationship. On the interfund transfers, we had a request from the athletic department recommended by Mr. Porter that we advance a second $20,000 subsidy to our athletic program. That is now, will be 40 of the 45,000 that was totally budgeted for that. The other items are routine monthly items.
Can you talk about what the total is for, what is the projected annual growth or income from our investments, that now we have 80% of that much?
Yes. We, just a moment here, to get to the right page. We had budgeted for this year based on our previous asset mix and maturity mix that we would receive, take these glasses off, $650,000. Last year at the same point in time, we had earned $214,000 compared to this year's $519,000. Again, a little bit that's the timing of maturities, but a lot of it is change of our investment tactics and strategies that we're using.
Thank you so much for making that happen. That adds
Yes,
up.
we pursue very diligently any opportunities to generate non-tax revenues to support our instructional program, so we feel good about it.
Any other questions, comments? Motion?
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
And as a follow-up to the tax budget hearing we conducted earlier this evening, 7H is a recommendation to approve and authorize me to file with the Lake County Budget Commission the 2018-2019 tax budget.
So moved.
Second.
Any questions? Please call the roll.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
Next, the Lake County Budget Commission has presented to us a recertification of tax rates for tax year 2017 to be collected in 2018. I recommend they be approved as presented in Exhibit 7-I.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
And that completes my agenda items this evening.
Thank you. Any unfinished business? Any new business? Just want to welcome the new board members. And again, congratulations, Mrs. Scheschling, on your reelection.
Thank you.
All right, next we will entertain any hearing of the public on any item. No one? Okay, thank you. The board will now, I will entertain a motion for the board going into executive session to discuss the Interim superintendent's evaluation.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. No vote is expected. Feel free to stay or you may leave. Thank you for coming tonight.